Hi, my name is Rachel Busick, and I'm going to be talking about autism and social communication. So, social communication with the autism spectrum disorder is a bit different than social communication within typically developing children. Children with autism spectrum disorder often struggle with communication and social relationships. They have difficulty understanding social situations and body language, which are often unspoken elements of a relationship. And unspoken social cues allow individuals to gauge what others around them are feeling and reacting to social situations, and it gives a direction on how to respond. So, if a child's in a situation where someone's kind of visibly looking frustrated or moving their body angrily or kind of like agitated and kind of like moving their shoulders or like tensing up, a typically developing person can tell like, oh, that person's feeling very frustrated with the conversation, like wants it to stop. So on the spectrum, it's not going to grasp that social cue and it's going to continue to talk and be unaware that they're making someone else frustrated. Um, Deficits in ASD are typically involved in social and cognitive skills, so difficulty reading others' emotions and cognitive states can limit a person's ability to meaningfully build on the conversation and have present understanding and engagement. Individuals on the spectrum struggle to understand a narrative conversation when all aspects are not explicitly stated, such as if someone is emotionally upset or even attracted to them. So, someone that's on the spectrum isn't going to understand where the conversation is going if it's not directly verbalized to them, and they're gonna misinterpret or misunderstand emotional states. So if someone's happy or angry, and they're not visibly saying it, and they don't look like with tears or their face isn't red, and there's no like visible visual sign, they just like body language and the way that they're speaking tells you that they're agitated. Someone who's on the spectrum isn't going to be aware that that's what's happening. Individuals with ASD often tend to misunderstand or even overlook these situations, which can lead to difficulty sustaining friendships with their typically developing peers. Children with ASD often struggle to form close relationships and friendships with typically developing peers, so it's hard for them to form these relationships because there's such a strain on the social relationship that when they're with typically developing peers, it's hard for them to maintain close ties because it's difficult for them to engage in peer play interaction, which can sever ties and create a kind of a weird social situation for everyone involved. So really where social situation and communication comes into effect is on the playground. That's the most common place for social communication differences. Because children are playing make-believe or pretend games. Children with ASD may not understand the difference in narratives or forms that the game takes, and it may be difficult for children to follow the social script if it's not explicitly stated or understood. So if they're playing house and it's not explicitly stated like who's doing what or what's happening and just kind of like going with the flow, children on the spectrum are not going to understand like what's happening or how to kind of engage in that game, and it's going to make it very difficult for them to play and have kind of peer relationships. This can cause difficulties in maintaining friendships over periods of time, especially when the children are in classes together year after year. So when children are constantly engaged with each other and it's not going well, and it's not going well for years, those children are not going to have close friendships or maintained friendships, and it's going to create kind of a severance of the children's relationship with each other. Oftentimes, children on the spectrum have very specific interests, such as dinosaurs or planets, and if the games they are playing with typically developing peers deviate from these topics, children with ASD often do not know how to handle the change in topic and are unfamiliar with how to continue. So, children on the spectrum feel very uncomfortable with situations they don't understand, and they kind of perseverate or obsess over specific things or topics, such as dinosaurs or planets. And they know and understand that, and it's comfortable, and so they can talk about it for hours and continue on and going because that's just what they're super interested in, and they kind of get stuck on it. Typically, developing children move very quickly through things, and they're not really looking to hear about that for hours because they're not interested in that specifically. Maybe like a minute or two, and after that, they're kind of done and ready to move on. But a child with ASD is not, and so it can create kind of a behavioral situation at times because the child's not ready to move on and the other child is, and it create kind of conflict in the social situation. This is often frustrating, typically developing peers. However, due to the lack of social understanding, children with ASD cannot tell when their peers are frustrated or upset with how the game is going, and it can lead to severed ties between peers and or non-preferred play partners, as I said before. This can lead to isolating situations for children with ASD simply because they did not understand the social narrative and nonverbal communication involved in peer play interaction. So they weren't aware that their friend was getting upset or irritated with how the game was going or what they were talking about. And so as the game continued, they were unaware that they had made their friend very upset. And so it can create isolating situations in which typically developing peers aren't willing to play with peers with ASD because it's just not an easy social communication, and it kind of is, there's a lot of barriers involved, and one child wants to play one way and it's very rigid and strict, and their child is willing to move around but doesn't want to play by the same script every single time. So within the classroom, there are many things that teachers can do in order to alleviate social barriers between typically developing children. One of these things is peer-mediated interventions. There are many peer-mediated interventions that can take place both in the classroom and on the playground that allow children with ASD and their typically developing peers to understand their social differences, increasing the likelihood of friendship and interaction. So the strategy is more commonly used during the playground, during recess, and this program is targeted towards children with ASD and is directed toward improving social interaction skills. So basically this is the typically developing children that are teaching their peers with ASD how to interact and communicate with each other and kind of define the social situation and how to use words to verbalize what's happening. So everyone's kind of on the same page. So this specific study targeted second graders, and it used various strategies including modeling, direct instruction, and social reinforcement, which was modeled by typically developing peers and was carried out during recess time for the children. The study was conducted over 14 sessions, and changes were observed after these 14 sessions were completed. Children with ASD had higher rates of initiation and response times towards interactions, and lower amount of time was spent in low-intensity interactions or alone. So basically, children on the spectrum were able to understand like what was happening, respond to the social situation, respond to a child asking them to play, and reciprocate that more easily than before. And there was a lower amount of time spent in high intensity situations, so like one-on-one conversations or like a simple game was more like play based, and then there was less time spent alone, so children were engaged with each other more often and more frequently. And then children were modeling and instructing each other and using social reinforcement kind of to encourage and direct each other how the play should go. These effects of this peer-mediated intervention were not only seen in peer interactions, but were also noticed by the families and teachers of the children themselves. So there were noticed improvements in social skills, greater peer acceptance, and overall increase in both the frequency and duration of social interactions. This allowed children to understand and learn from their peers and encourage peer relationships, and created a positive environment in which children felt comfortable learning and understanding from one another. So it kind of created a social situation in itself and allowed children to understand and learn from each other and kind of have an accepting space where they can feel comfortable versus a teacher kind of being involved. It kind of created a peer-led situation, which was really beneficial for the children. There's also weaknesses to this peer-mediated intervention, so there's a lot of time and effort required by the teacher both in and out of the classroom. They're using recess time, so she's having to create and train the children on how to do this and interact with each other, which is creating resources in and outside of the class time. The amount of students per classroom may vary, so that made it a little hard. You also have to get training from a specialized person, and so training non-specialized personnel on how to teach and direct the peer interactions may be complicated. There also may be an insufficient number of specialist teachers in regular schools. There also may be families who want to focus on academics rather than social emotional aspects and don't understand the benefits of that. And also fitting within the educational policies framework might be difficult. And there's also a cost factor. It may be a little bit expensive to afford this curriculum and to teach it as well. There's also social skills curriculum. So this curriculum is aimed at improving well-being for children with ASD and the attainment of meaningful friendships. So the object of this curriculum is social skills and interactions, and the curriculum implements social rules, which creates an environment in which social situations are more easily read. This not only benefits children who are on the spectrum, but typically developing peers as well. So it helps both aspects of children typically developing and children on the spectrum understand kind of what's going on and be on the same page. The curriculum targets distinct aspects and elements of ASD that are present in social interactions, and it may create a difficulty for children to form and maintain lasting peer relationships. So these elements of interactions that are hard, it kind of helps to remove that barrier and make it a little bit easier for children to interact with each other. So some of the distinct aspects and elements of the curriculum it targets are difficulty in reciprocating or initiating social situations, preservation on topics of personal interest, like I say, when kids perseverate and are very interested in one thing specifically, and the difficulty interpreting non-literal speech such as sarcasm. The curriculum is designed to improve outcomes associated with the formation of peer relationships and social inclusion, which can persist into adulthood. Peer relationships can be assisted through this curriculum by creating an environment in which all children are aware of social situations and are given an explanation when there is a misunderstanding within a social situation. So what's going on? Why is it happening? Where do we have this breakthrough? Where do we kind of come to a stop? Allowing children to understand where exactly the misinterpretation happened and why is very helpful. This can lead to improved outcomes into adulthood and can lead to better peer relationships, which are open and honest. Teachers can provide an inclusive and accepting environment for their students by implementing social curriculum through the classroom teaching. There are also weaknesses to this model, so the curriculum may be ill-equipped to improve social competence and relationships with individuals with ASD for the following reasons. The content is focused on normative rules for social behavior that does not adequately depict how social interactions are negotiated, so it's very cut and dry, and social interactions are very flowing. They kind of ebb and flow different ways, and so it's very straightforward and direct, which is not really how a natural social situation occurs. There's also little room for the development or enactment of psychological, relational, and interactional authenticity. So how things affect other people, how the conversation may go, how people may take things. There's not really a lot of room for that. And so it can create a problem and kind of a barrier for those children to understand oh, what do I do with this? Because we didn't learn about that. And it's just very cut and dry and not natural. This also can contribute to the stigmatization of individuals with autism by refining an ideology that there is a correct way to engage interaction and encouraging individuals with ASD to pass on as non-autistic. So kind of this is how you're supposed to interact. If you don't interact this way, it's not correct. It can make children on the spectrum feel like they're wrong or inferior for not understanding how to interact the technically appropriate way, which is just they interact a little bit differently, and that's okay, and they feel like it's not. And so it can kind of create a barrier or a stigma between them and the other children. So the call to action. So interventions such as these have implications not only in the school system, but positive effects within family and peer relationships into adulthood. Teachers and educators should consider these implications for practice within the classroom in order to build a more inclusive and peer-centered classroom environment. So implementation of research-based practices into classrooms and school environments can have long-lasting effects on both typically developing children and children with ASD. Teachers can implement curriculum into their classrooms that teaches social skills both indirectly and directly, providing a non-judgmental and easy to understand environment for all children. And teachers can use peers to model and illustrate what effective and appropriate social situations and responses should look like, which in turn can provide healthy and clear instruction to children who are on the spectrum. So just understanding where everybody is being on the same page, and having typically developing children understand where their peers who are on the spectrum are coming from and how they're interacting differently is a really big step in understanding how social situations are different for all your classmates and everyone involved. And those are my references. Thank you.